That energy and focus and attention to our next speaker, Dr. Julia Kim. She starts our conference with her first speech. Julia is a senior advisor for the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan, where she came in from. It's a long journey, and she came here to tell you about Bhutan and the concept of happiness and how this applies to a state in Bhutan. Julia is a trained doctor, a medical doctor, and she worked as a health advisor and developing advisor in Asia and in Africa for a long time. And she also participated in 2012 at a high-level UN meeting about well-being and happiness, called as the New Economic Paradigm. Give us a warm applause to Dr. Julia Kim.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd really like to thank Alfred and the whole team at Wisdom Stockholm for this amazing event that they've set up. This is my first time in Sweden, and I'm really delighted to be here. I'd like to share a little bit of my experience in the form of a story of Bhutan, because I think in a time of great transition and change, we all need the power of a good story, of a good narrative, to give us a sense of what the future might hold. So I'd like to tell a little bit of the story of how I came to be in Bhutan. I'll talk a little bit about my personal journey. Alfred alluded to my roots in the UN. A little bit about the global crisis that we're facing now, and the winds of change that I've been feeling blowing through our world at this time. I'll share a little bit about Bhutan and gross national happiness, and then finally conclude with a few thoughts about vision and action, maybe to inspire us in the coming days. In terms of my own story, I was initially working in South Africa at the time of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, a time before antiretroviral drugs, when there was a great deal of social upheaval, a lot of poverty. And it was quite discouraging to me as a doctor to see that we weren't really addressing the root causes of the problems that were driving the epidemic in South Africa. I would shuttle back and forth between a small rural village in South Africa, and that picture on the right is a subway in London where I was studying public health. And the thing that struck me, apart from the initial shock of the poverty that I was seeing around me, was actually the sense of life and liveliness that I experienced in South Africa. There were times when I would go into a small village home to do a survey about HIV, and I'd learn that there was no food in the house and that children actually had not eaten properly for the last few days. And as I'd be packing up my surveys and getting ready to move to the next home, I'd be more than once touched by the head of the household, usually the mother, asking me if I would stay for a meal. This after I just learned that they didn't have enough food in the house. And it really struck me, the sense that people could be generous and full of so much life in that context, when I'd often go into the subway in London and look at the faces of people and not see any eye contact at all. Fast forward to when I moved to New York, that's Times Square over there, and began working at the United Nations, again addressing global health challenges. And at that time, I was beginning to move back and forth to Bhutan and seeing again the contrast between the lower level of development in a small nation like Bhutan and the extremely developed, fast-paced world of New York. All this led me to ask some critical questions for someone who'd been working in development for a long time. For example, what really is development? And is there such a thing as overdevelopment? We were talking all about developing countries and underdevelopment. And it really made me wonder, what is the relationship between happiness and development? Alfred alluded to the social upheaval that we're witnessing around the world. I think we're all familiar with these kinds of images now, but they're spreading like wildfire. A lot of inequalities, a lot of social unrest, and a wish for some kind of change, something that would shift us from this system, from this present situation, as Alfred said, that we're creating and not really wanting, to something more hopeful for our future. At the same time, we know that we're facing environmental crisis, more and more droughts, more and more climate instability, and a great deal of discontent and fear at what the future might hold as we're consuming our resources on this planet. In this context, a lot of economists and national leaders have begun to ask, is this development model, this pursuit of GDP growth, really serving our planet? Or could there be alternative ways of looking at development? I think we're also aware that the financial crisis has really sparked our curiosity and our wish to find other models of looking at development. There's interesting research now that shows that wealthier countries are not necessarily happier ones. And this is news in the context of income being important for life satisfaction up to a point. I think everyone would agree that we need to have a roof over our heads and know that our kids can go to school. But up to a certain point of development, up to a certain level of income, happiness doesn't actually continue to go higher and higher as GDP goes up within a country. So that's an interesting question. Why is that? On a more personal, individual level, there's been some interesting psychological research that has pointed to something called hedonic adaptation. And it kind of sounds like what it is. If hedonism is pleasure and feeling happiness, then hedonic adaptation is something about our human psychological mindset that as we make more money, our experiences of wanting more and of desiring more also goes up, so that there isn't a level of happiness that we feel a real sense of contentment. That's coined the phrase the hedonic treadmill, and I don't know if anyone in this room can relate to that picture. But the sense that we're constantly having to run faster and faster on the treadmill, working harder and harder just to maintain the status quo, just to maintain our level of happiness. What's interesting on a population level is that inequality plays a great role in our sense of well-being and happiness within a country. This is a graph from a book called The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett that brought together a lot of the world data on inequality. These are all developed countries that we see here on the graph. We have income inequality on this axis, on the horizontal axis, and an index of social and health problems on the vertical axis, things like homicide rates, people in prison, drug addiction. And what we see amongst these developed countries is a very linear relationship between inequality and worse social problems. So the United States up here on this axis at the top has the worst inequality and the worst index in terms of these social problems. A more egalitarian developed country like Japan has less. So again, an interesting relationship between increasing GDP growth, inequality, and more unhappiness. So what does count for our happiness? Not surprisingly, in a number of different surveys, we find that things like community trust, good governance, meaningful and secure work, a sense of work-life balance, these are all things that people say matter to them more than just increasing increments of salary. So in this context, we've begun to hear more and more challenge of the GDP-based economic model. And Lorenzo Fiermonti will be speaking more about that to sort of take us further into it. But I think what's interesting is that this interrogation of GDP is not just coming from our time. In fact, I'd like to show you a short video clip that dates back to the 1960s and Robert Kennedy, and I think some of the words will ring true.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and sex knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
So I don't know if you picked up some of those messages there, but it's fascinating. GDP measures only marketed economic activity, and it counts all this as positive, regardless of whether it's a positive value to society. So if you cut down those trees in order to make timber, regardless of the impact on the environment, on climate change, it makes GDP go up. If you build more prisons, in spite of the fact that there's more crime, GDP is going to go up. But it also leaves out many of the things that we know enhance our well-being, the things that I mentioned earlier, communities that have a sense of trust, families that are close, music and the arts, all of these things, unless there's a price tag connected to them, don't count in terms of GDP. So in this context, the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, said that our old model is broken. We need to create a new one, a vision for equitable human development, a healthy planet, and enduring economic dynamism. It was at this time that I was working at the UN, at UNICEF, and really wondering what was going to happen in 2015 when we were looking at new measures for progress. And I was sitting at my desk going through the hundreds of emails that were accumulating there, and I got one invitation to a meeting that really piqued my interest. It was a high-level UN meeting on happiness and well-being, and it was going to be hosted by the government of Bhutan. Now, I had not even heard of this small Himalayan country before, but I was struck by the invitation which said that happiness and the well-being of all life forms should be at the center of our development. And it was particularly that word, that phrase, all life forms, that I thought was incredibly interesting. I wasn't the only one. About 800 different delegates from around the world came to learn about the happiness resolution. It was included the Secretary General, the President of Costa Rica, Nobel Peace Prize laureates like the economist Joseph Stiglitz, and all kinds of different spiritual leaders from around the world, indigenous groups, all who were seeing something remarkable about this call for happiness. In the meeting, we talked about the current global economic paradigm as really being outmoded and really not taking us where we wanted to be, and raised the question, what would a new economic paradigm look like? One that really reconnected our economy to society and nature. I was fortunate to be asked to join a group of different experts from across different fields in writing this report to the UN towards a new development paradigm under the leadership of the government of Bhutan. And that report was then submitted to the UN as part of the discussions for the new Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, I think we were also hearing a little bit of whisper about a new vision for business as well, because business couldn't be seen as separate from the discussions that were happening at the UN. I think all of us have been following the news closely with the latest scandal about Volkswagen. The Economist noted in their story recently that Volkswagen admitted installing software on their diesel cars which basically allowed them to fake the stringent emission rules in order to try and sell more of their cars. Since September 18th, when the story broke, VW's shares have fallen by 1/3, cutting its value by €26 billion. So a huge, huge loss and loss of face for VW. It was interesting if you read the article to ask, what was one of the driving forces between this really kind of much admired auto manufacturer taking this turn? And it was very much what you might expect, this real drive to be number one, to be at the top of the auto industry. But I'd like us to pause, and as we think about how we measure success, ask ourselves, what would the story have been like if being number one were actually measured differently, beyond just sales and dominating the financial markets? It's interesting that different business journals are beginning to talk about creating shared value. Although a lot of companies still see it in terms of corporate social responsibility, basically just doing the minimum to get by, to keep your good image, shared value would be about creating economic value in a way that maximizes the benefits for society by directly addressing the needs and the challenges, such as the environmental crisis. We need to measure what matters. We need to create a different vision of what business is really about. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Bhutan and gross national happiness. Could I have a show of hands, just how many people have heard of GNH? Oh, wow. Okay, then I can just go home now. I think GNH really was coined as a phrase in 1972 when the fourth king of Bhutan, at the age of 17 years old, was asked by a reporter in relation to this small country, so what is the GNP of Bhutan? And he replied right away, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. So really trying to say, in a nutshell, we need a shift of mindset from economic growth at all costs to asking what kind of growth and to what purpose. The current king of Bhutan, Jigme Khesar Namgyal Wangchuk, said, many people talk to me about what is GNH, but to me, GNH is simply development with values. It's the bridge between the fundamental values of kindness, equality, and humanity, and the necessary pursuit of economic growth. So again, seeing this balance between the outward material development and the inner values that we're talking about here at Wisdom Stockholm. And I think it's really important to note that Bhutan is a living experiment. If you were to come to this country, you would hear that they don't have all the answers. They don't believe that they've got the solution to all these crises. They've been opening up to the modern world since the 1960s, and they're not immune to the kinds of materialist temptations that are coming into any country. Increasingly, young people are exposed to the internet, to advertising. They're also wanting to engage with the modern world. And so in that context, it's really important to put this philosophy of GNH into action. And I'd like to share a little bit about how the government is doing that. One way is through measurement. As I said earlier, we need to measure what really matters. So the GNH index and policy screening tool are being used in Bhutan. We're really asking, how can businesses rise to the highest potential as a positive contributor to society? This would be applying GNH in the field of business. So a little bit about gross national happiness. I think many of you might be familiar with this image of a mandala. You know, it really has the sense that there are these different elements that are interdependent with one another. One isn't necessarily more important than the others, but together they're meant to create the context or the environment in which people can be happy. You'll see things like psychological well-being, time use, which aren't normally measured in a lot of national surveys. Things like community vitality, how well are our communities connected to each other, how well do neighbors know each other, cultural diversity and resilience, something that's important to countries in Europe as they're welcoming all these diverse new groups into their shores. Also indigenous groups, how well are our communities and cultural values surviving the transition to modernity, as well as the sort of basic things that you would measure like living standards, education, and health. Oftentimes, GNH is summarized as these four pillars: socioeconomic development, cultural diversity, environment, and good governance, to sort of sum up what those 9 different domains are. I mentioned the GNH survey. That's undertaken every 3 years. Bhutan has just finished a large population-based survey this year and are analyzing the data. And it really aims to measure people's happiness and well-being and the conditions, those 9 domains that I mentioned, that lead to happiness. It's not that you have to score 100% on all 9 domains. It's really creating a sufficiency threshold where 6 out of 9 of those domains, if you score well in those, you're considered to be happy. And then the government will really try to prioritize areas where happiness is low. If, for example, in rural areas, the sense of basic living standards is not being met, how do they improve that? In urban areas, if community vitality is going down, how can the government put policies in place to improve it? The G&H Commission is really like the planning commission of government. And what they do is they apply a G&H screening tool to new plans and proposals in the country to see what kind of impact they would have on those 9 domains. So beyond something like an environmental impact assessment, they would also want to know what will be the impact of, for example, a new hydro project on community vitality, on culture, on time use. These things are all considered, and then a proposal or plan can be revised in order to improve it. I want to talk now a little bit about the different domains of G&H in Bhutan and how they might apply to us in this room. Let's start with living standards. I think it's important to point out that G&H doesn't mean that economic growth or addressing poverty isn't important. Rather, it puts it in perspective. It's 1 out of the 9 domains. And also, although Bhutan is a small country, it's, over the past decade, the GDP growth rate has exceeded most emerging Asian economies. And they've managed to do this while keeping a low unemployment rate in their country. In terms of the environment, unlike other countries which are pursuing economic growth, Bhutan has really prioritized environmental conservation. And it's stunning. If you were to fly to Bhutan, as you're coming into the country, all you can see are Himalayan mountains and miles of absolutely pristine forest. They've managed to increase their forest cover from 65% to 80% while growing as a country. And in their constitution, they commit to maintain over 60% forest cover for all time. So a very clear message about how protecting the environment is important to them. In terms of business in G&H, they've really pursued high-value, low-impact tourism, which means that as a tourist, you have to pay more to get into the country, but they try to restrict the number of tourists who come in order to preserve the environment and also preserve the culture there. It's interesting that they're also being very smart about how they use technology. So that's a picture of Thimphu, the capital city there. And you'll notice that there isn't a single traffic light in the town. You can see a cock conducting traffic through the main street. And yet they're pursuing electric vehicles. They're trying to introduce green taxis into the capital city. So again, this amazing combination of tradition and modern and smart use of technology. I think time use, I don't need to say so much into anyone in the room here, but I think as we multitask and get through all our different roles in our lives, we're realizing that our sense of work-life balance is really important to our sense of happiness. And this is confirmed in a lot of different surveys where people are increasingly noting stress and unhappiness over the amount of time they have to work, how little time they have to spend with their family and their kids. I think it's amazing that when there is free time, it's increasingly spent on devices, cell phones, iPads, digital devices, social media. And kids are increasingly and alarmingly spending more time on that than any other activity. This study by Kaiser Family Foundation found that in the US, children ages 8 to 18 spend 8.5 hours a day watching TV or using digital media. So that's more time than they spend on any other activity besides sleeping. We know that watching television is associated with higher obesity, lower sleep, fewer social ties, higher sense of materialism, and this increase in upward social comparison. You can see kids wanting to have the latest iPhone, the latest shoes. Again, that sense of that hedonic treadmill starting very early. Psychological well-being is an interesting one that Bhutan measures in their surveys to see how well people are doing. I think as Alfred mentioned in his opening remarks, we're seeing a wave of psychological dis-ease in developed countries. In fact, in most middle-income and high-income countries now, depression is the main contributor, the main healthcare cost in terms of poor health. In Bhutan, they've actually decided to put a limit on public advertising. If you were to go into the capital city now, you would see a few Coca-Cola signs, but that's pretty much about it. They've really tried to limit how much advertising comes into the consciousness of their society. They also believe that the capacity for happiness can be cultivated, and that may not be new to people in the room here. I was relieved when Alfred started us off with a moment of mindfulness this morning. Personally, I didn't have enough time to meditate on my way over here this morning, but that sense of really just grounding yourself, of connecting to your heart, is something that in Bhutan they believe can be cultivated. Mindfulness and compassion now are real buzzwords in a lot of different fora. That's a photo of the Buddhist monk Matthieu Ricard at the World Economic Forum. And across different business communities, you're now seeing more and more questioning about what that could bring into our mindsets in the business community. I think it's been supported by a lot of the more recent research coming from the field of neuroscience, where we're learning about neuroplasticity, the fact that if you practice meditation every day consistently, it can actually rewire parts of your brain that allow you to be more empathetic, to respond more quickly, and to be more calm when stress comes up. So I'd like to conclude by sharing a few thoughts around vision and action, around things that may help us to think where we might want to go forward as we gather together over the next couple of days. What are signs of hope? Where are we trying to push the system a little bit? I'd like to talk a little bit about the Global Wellbeing Lab, and I have a few colleagues in the room who have been working on this project with me. It's a collaboration between GIZ, BMZ in Germany, the Global Leadership Academy, my home institution, which is the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan, and the Presencing Institute, which is based in Boston, Massachusetts. And really what we did is bring a group of 25 changemakers from around the world to really experience Bhutan and GNH and to really try to understand what it meant in their own home context. This year is the second wave of participants who've joined this global lab. It included people like Eileen Fisher, who is the founder of Eileen Fisher Clothing in the United States, who's been a real leader in bringing compassion into business. And for her, it's not just about talking about it. She said that she would really like to see how she could bring the vision of GNH as a sort of spiritual beacon into her company, right along the whole value chain. The Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, is being implemented in the United States as an alternative to measuring just GDP growth, and it's being taken up by a number of different states. And Lou Daly, who is a participant in one of these labs, has been really spearheading that work. Lorenzo Firmati, who you'll be hearing from in a few moments, has really been looking at challenging the GDP model, both in South Africa, where he's based, but increasingly around the world, looking at what would be the value if a number of different companies were to say, let's put well-being at the center of development, calling it the well-being economies, or We7. I think the Wisdom Conferences, where we're going to be in the next couple of days, is a really amazing starting point for getting people together to start talking about what an alternative model could look like, and really sharing our own real-life experiences in real time to learn from each other. I'd like to end by talking a little bit about inner transformation and social change. As somebody who has been a kind of activist in the public health field and in the development field for some time, there have been times when I've really felt like I need to go out into the world, put my boots on, and really just do the work that needs to get done. And then I have to confess that there's times when I've been completely disillusioned and kind of giving up hope at the ability to change these systems, when I've had exactly the opposite response. Maybe I just need to find a quiet place, sit down, and really work on my own mind, on the reality that I'm creating. And I'm beginning to feel now that it's really both of those coming together, that all of us are being called on to work on our own inner transformation while we're doing the work of social change, and that somehow the two of them come together can be incredibly powerful. I love this quote from Albert Einstein in 1945, where he really pointed to the power of our mind. As a physicist, He was really drawing our attention to the power of our mind to create the world in which we live in. He said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And it echoes incredibly these words from the Buddha, 500 BC. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. So what kind of world are we making with our thoughts, with our minds and our hearts today? I think we have a tendency to focus on what's visible, on what's outside, the tree, and not to focus on the roots, the things that are more hidden. But I hope that in the coming days, we'll discuss how the two can be connected. How can we actually address the inner values that are driving the world that we're seeing around us? At the GNH Center in Bhutan, we're really trying to bring the inner dimensions and the outer dimensions together. We're partnering with local and international institutions, and we're really trying to apply the latest research in compassion and mindfulness and creating social values into the work that we're doing. We're now conducting leadership programs for business and government and civil society. If any one of you in the room is interested in hearing more about it, please speak to me. We're trying to really build this into a global network and a global partnership. Lately, we've been realizing it's important to work with younger people, so we've been focusing a lot of our energy on working in schools, partnering with ministries of education in Bhutan, in Vietnam, and it looks like we'll be working in Thailand also, to try and bring this mindset into the schools so kids aren't just learning how to be clever, how to pass their math tests, but really learning how to interrogate the world that they're living in and connect to their feeling of wanting to serve. This is a picture of the GNH Center land, this beautiful river, and an architectural plan for the actual physical GNH Center that we want to build in a rural area of the country. When I head back to Bhutan at the end of this conference, we'll be inaugurating 2 new buildings on the land, and we're trying to build in the principles of GNH, really looking at preserving the cultural style of the buildings, but bringing the latest green technology. So we're hoping that that will be a gathering place for like-minded people. And finally, I'd like to end with a short video that talks about the power of our minds and our mindset, just switching our vision slightly in order to create a different future.
I am part of a lost generation, and I refuse to believe that I can change the world. I realize this may be a shock, but happiness comes from within is a lie, and money will make me happy. So in 30 years, I will tell my children they are not the most important thing in my life. My employer will know that I have my priorities straight because work is more important than family. I tell you this, once upon a time, families stayed together. But this will not be true in my era. This is a quick fix society. Experts tell me 30 years from now, I will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of my divorce. I do not concede that I will live in a country of my own making. In the future, environmental destruction will be the norm. No longer can it be said that my peers and I care about this earth. It will be evident that my generation is apathetic and lethargic. It is foolish to presume that there is hope. And all of this will come true unless we choose to reverse it. There is hope. It is foolish to presume that my generation is apathetic and lethargic. It will be evident that my peers and I care about this earth. No longer can it be said that environmental destruction will be the norm. In the future, I will live in a country of my own making. I do not concede that 30 years from now, I will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of my divorce. Experts tell me this is a quick fix society, but this will not be true in my era. Families stayed together once upon a time. I tell you this, family is more important than work. I have my priorities straight because my employer will know that they are not the most important thing in my life. So in 30 years, I will tell my children, money will make me happy is a lie, and true happiness comes from within. I realize this may be a shock, but I can change the world, and I refuse to believe that I am part of a lost generation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Every time I see this, the last video, I'm getting goosebumps, and it's like, wow, that's so easy how you can change actually the perception, can you? Let's try it, you know, in our daily life. It would be nice. I would like to hear a little bit more about, you know, foreigners who are coming to Bhutan and joining your workshops in the G&H Center. What did you experience in their journey while they are there? And when they are back, what is the feedback? What is the reaction?
Thank you, Alfred. You know, it's interesting. I think when people come to Bhutan, there's so much hope and expectation. They've heard so much about it, that there's this initial wave of exhilaration of being there, and then a sudden kind of crash when people realize, what, it's not Shangri-La? It's not perfect? And then they start to open their eyes a little bit more and start to engage, and they say, okay, so Bhutan is also facing the same challenges as we are, but they have this incredible vision and they're working to make it happen. And they begin to see the interdependence between where they come from, say Sweden, and Bhutan. So one of the ministers said, you know, Bhutan can't be a G&H bubble in a GDP world. We're also connected to the rest of you, and so we need to learn together. And so I think when people come to Bhutan, it's really with an intention of, what can I bring back to my own country? Whether that's a sense of bringing in new measures of success into their business, as Eileen Fisher was doing, whether it's about working with young people to really shift the education system from just purely sort of thinking and trying to get the best job you can to really cultivating your human capacity. And then we try to help them take what's relevant and inspiring in Bhutan and adapt it and sort of work with it in their own environment. So that's kind of the experience, I think. It would, if I were to draw it on a graph, it would be and then something like that.
If you would have a wish list for the audience here, what would that be?
I think it would be that sense of real questioning and openness and hope. So I think, you know, all of us are feeling at times a little bit hopeless about the future that we're facing. If we're watching the headlines and if we have kids, we're really worried. But I think we're also at a time of enormous creativity and connectivity. The fact that all of us are here in this room and came here interested to learn and to try and create a better future, it's all possible. I really have the sense that, you know, everything that we need is actually here right now. As I was saying to you when we met this morning, you know, it's just a matter of the right connections and the right resources and the right people coming together. The solutions aren't as far away as we think, but we have to be very open and open our hearts as well as our minds.
Thank you so much, Julia. Give a warm applause.